When my wife told me, "Don't embarrass me, just stay quiet at dinner," I nodded and kept my mouth shut. But when her boss asked what I did for a living, I looked him in the eye and said, "I own the company." Her fork hit the plate, and so did her carefully built image. Power doesn't shout. It waits. Then it rewrites the room. And you won't believe what happened after that dinner. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. It started with a single line, almost thrown over her shoulder like it was nothing. "Just don't embarrass me at dinner, okay?" Miranda didn't even look at me when she said it. She was halfway down the hallway, adjusting her earrings in the mirror, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a metronome, counting down the moments I had left to answer. I stood there, tie in hand, staring at her reflection. We'd been married for 16 years. 16 years of me cheering her on, holding her hand through promotions and late-night deadlines, raising our kids while she built her image of corporate success. But I'd never heard her say that before. "Don't embarrass me." Like I was some misbehaving child she had to drag to a parent-teacher conference. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She sighed. "It just means, keep it light. You don't need to talk about all your weird hobbies or whatever. These are important people. My boss, his wife, his team. Let's just keep things professional." Weird hobbies. I could have laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I knotted my tie and walked out the door behind her. The restaurant was one of those dimly lit places with white tablecloths and waiters who bowed slightly every time they topped up your wine. It was upscale, exclusive, and absurdly overbooked unless you had a name that carried weight. Apparently, Miranda's boss did. We were the last to arrive. She walked ahead of me, waving as she spotted them, 6 people already seated at a round table in the corner, laughing about something that probably involved quarterly reports or networking events. I recognized the man at the head of the table, Gerald Barnes, CEO of the marketing firm Miranda worked for. I'd seen his face on the company newsletter, in press releases, and once in a glossy magazine spread that called him the man who reinvented media. "Gerald," Miranda cooed, her voice suddenly 3 octaves higher. "So sorry we're late." "Nonsense," he beamed, standing to kiss her cheek. "We were just getting started." Everyone's eyes shifted to me, trailing just a few paces behind her. I smiled politely. Gerald offered his hand. "And this must be your husband." I shook it firmly. "Pleasure to meet you." We sat down. The introductions came fast. Eleanor, Gerald's wife. 2 VPs, Brett and Kara. Some finance director named Marvin. All polished, all smiling with just the right amount of performative charm. Miranda leaned in and whispered behind her wine glass, "Just smile and nod, please." I took a sip of water and let the quiet burn settle in my chest. The first 20 minutes were harmless. Wine flowed. Bread baskets were passed around. Gerald told a story about his house in the Hamptons, something about a boat motor failing mid-bay. Everyone laughed too hard. Miranda was glowing. She tossed her hair, chimed in with punchlines, touched my arm only when necessary to keep up appearances. And I played along. I answered questions when I was asked, said "indeed" more than I usually would, laughed softly, made exactly 0 jokes, because I was watching her, studying the way she kept glancing at me like I was a ticking time bomb. Then it happened. "So," Gerald said, folding his napkin neatly across his lap, "what is it that you do exactly?" Miranda froze. I felt it more than saw it. Her back stiffened. Her fork hovered mid-air. The conversation around the table paused, just for a second, but enough to feel it. The air thickened. I looked straight at Gerald and smiled. "Oh," I said casually, "I own the company." Her fork fell. It hit the edge of the plate and clattered against the fine china, bouncing once onto the tablecloth. Everyone's eyes darted to her, then back to me. Gerald blinked. "I'm sorry," he said. "You own which company?" Miranda's lips parted. No sound came out. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and looked at her. 16 years of being her behind-the-scenes fixer. 16 years of my work being just some tech stuff. 16 years of being told to stay quiet. It was time. And this dinner? This was only the beginning. You see, Miranda never really asked what I did. Not in the way people ask when they want to know. She asked like someone going through the motions. "How was your day?" "Busy?" Before switching the subject to her office drama, or Brett's latest blunder, or how Gerald micromanaged the hell out of that campaign. At first, I didn't mind. I'd left the corporate world 10 years ago. Cashed out quietly. Started building my own thing. It started in the garage. Cliché, I know. But in that space where dust and spare parts once lived, I began writing code, testing ideas, building a platform. By the time the rest of the world noticed, I had already scaled. 3 shell companies, a holding firm in Delaware, lawyers that made problems disappear, a team of developers across 3 time zones. And now, I owned one of the fastest-growing AI infrastructure startups in North America. We had government contracts, tech partnerships, and a valuation that made even seasoned investors pause. But I never talked about it. Not because I was ashamed, but because she never cared to ask. She assumed I was just floating, maybe living off old investments, maybe tinkering with outdated tech. She told her colleagues I was consulting when they asked, told friends I was between projects. She liked the narrative of the humble, semi-retired husband who kept to himself. I let her keep it. Until now. Back at the table, Gerald stared at me like I'd just spoken another language. "You own a company?" he repeated, tone suddenly cautious. I nodded, letting the moment stretch. "Yes, a small thing, really. AI integration. Scaled B2B solutions. Mostly government and defense contracts." Marvin, the finance guy, perked up. "Wait, are you talking about Luminary Systems?" My lips twitched. "I am." A beat of silence fell over the table. Marvin leaned forward, his face lighting up. "You're that William." I shrugged. "Guilty." Miranda's eyes were wide. Panic sat behind them like a storm on the horizon. Gerald chuckled, a bit too loud. "You're being modest. Luminary just landed a $40 million Series C round. That's hardly small." I took another bite of steak, slow and measured. "We don't advertise much. We prefer performance over publicity." Kara, one of the VPs, chimed in. "Gerald, didn't you just say we were looking for an AI partner for the media analytics project?" "I did," he murmured, suddenly chewing much slower. Miranda cleared her throat, voice thin. "Williams always had side projects." I looked at her, really looked. Her cheeks were flushed with something between embarrassment and disbelief. She wasn't just shocked. She was blindsided. Because in her mind, I had always been lesser. The supportive husband, the one who didn't need the spotlight, the one who paid bills and picked up the kids and smiled politely at networking dinners. But now she realized she'd brought a quiet power to the table. One that didn't need to raise its voice to be felt. "I guess I should have Googled you," Brett laughed nervously, sipping his wine. I smiled. "You'd be surprised how little you find. We built the company to stay under the radar, but we're in most of your lives. If you use a government system, bank online, or talk to a smart home speaker." Eleanor, Gerald's wife, tilted her head. "So, you're wealthy?" Miranda nearly choked on her wine. I met Eleanor's gaze. "Let's just say I don't lose sleep over inflation." The table erupted into polite laughter. All except Miranda. She sat still, her posture rigid. Her carefully constructed image of being the successful one, the leader in the family, the shining example, was quietly disintegrating. And the worst part? I wasn't gloating. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't even taking credit. Because the truth was, this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth finally being visible in a room full of people who had been blind to it for too long. And Miranda? She'd built her entire identity around being the one who saved me from my drifting. But now she had to sit beside a man who didn't just own a business. He built an empire in silence. Her world was cracking. And the night had only just begun. The rest of dinner blurred around us. Conversations flowed, forks scraped plates, wine was poured, glasses clinked. But between Miranda and me, there was only silence. The kind of silence that hums loud in your bones. She sat with her back straight, jaw tight, fingers curled too delicately around her glass, as if gripping harder would crack her polished facade. She didn't speak to me, not once. And I didn't force it. Let her stew. Let her thoughts circle the drain of confusion, embarrassment, and dawning realization. For 16 years, I had been the man behind the curtain. Supportive, available, predictable. I made sure the kids were dressed for picture day, the gutters were cleaned before the storms, and the car was fueled every Sunday night. She'd called it love, her rock, but it was convenience. Miranda had become addicted to being the center of attention, the star of every story she told, the one with a career worth boasting about. And I had let her believe the illusion that I was safe, small, humble, retired. She never asked how I still funded our lifestyle, never wondered why I spent nights in my study with 3 screens and a headset on, never looked at the monthly statements, because it was easier to believe I was beneath her than beside her. When dessert arrived, some spun sugar confection I didn't touch, Gerald turned to me again. So tell me, William, how did you even start Luminary? What made you walk away from the corporate world? I could feel Miranda flinch beside me. I got tired of meetings that ended with nothing, I said. Tired of bureaucracy, tired of watching ideas die in boardrooms. Brett nodded. Yeah, that tracks. You did what most of us wish we had the guts to do. Miranda interjected for the first time since her fork fell. William's always been determined. He's good with systems. Good with systems? I almost laughed. That's like calling Da Vinci good with paint. But I let it go. She was grasping, drowning in the undertow of a narrative she couldn't control anymore. Gerald leaned forward, suddenly serious. Would you ever consider consulting? I mean, nothing formal. But we could really use that kind of insight. We're scaling our analytics division and it's a mess. Maybe, I replied coolly. I've been selective with partnerships. I prefer ones built on mutual respect. There it was, not loud, not confrontational, but a blade wrapped in velvet. Miranda's expression shifted, a flicker of panic beneath the polite smile she wore like armor. She knew Gerald would remember that line. And she knew, too, that if I walked out of that restaurant and didn't follow up, he'd wonder why. He'd start asking questions. She was used to managing impressions. But tonight, she couldn't control mine. After dinner, we stood outside the restaurant, while Gerald and his wife waited for their car. You'll have to come to the lake house sometime, Eleanor offered with a genuine smile. It's refreshing to meet someone who doesn't feel the need to perform. Miranda tightened beside me. I felt her pulse and the way her hand trembled slightly against her clutch. I'd love to, I said. Miranda and I haven't had a proper weekend away in a while. She looked at me then, the first real look since dinner began. Her eyes weren't angry. They were afraid. Afraid of what else I hadn't told her. afraid that the balance of power in our relationship, the one she believed so secure, was shifting beneath her feet. When our car pulled up, I opened the door for her. She slid in without a word. I joined her on the other side. Silence followed us home. No music, no questions, just the hum of tires on asphalt and the sound of her breathing, shallow, careful. She didn't speak until we pulled into the garage. "You lied to me," she whispered. I turned off the engine. "Number I just stopped correcting your assumptions." She turned in her seat, her face pale in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "You made me look like a fool." "No, Miranda. You made yourself look like someone who didn't know her own husband." She blinked hard, once, twice, then got out without slamming the door, because even now appearances mattered to her. And me? I sat in the dark, hands resting on the wheel, wondering how many years I'd let myself be this quiet version of a man. That version of me? He was dead, and she was just meeting the one I'd buried under silence. The house felt colder that night, though the thermostat hadn't moved. It was the kind of chill that didn't come from faulty insulation. It came from absence. The absence of illusion, of masks, of the fragile, brittle fantasy Miranda had carefully constructed and insisted we both live inside. She went upstairs without another word, heels silent on the carpeted steps. I stayed in the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. No scotch. No need for artificial courage. I already had what I needed, clarity. For years I had shrunk myself so she could shine. I played the role well. The husband who didn't need credit. The man who stood at the back of the room while she gave speeches and chased titles. I ironed her shirts for interviews, proofread her reports, made sure the kids stayed quiet while she took meetings from the den. And I was proud of her. God, I was. But somewhere along the way, that pride turned into permission. Permission for her to forget me. She never came to the garage during my long nights at the computer. Never asked what I was working on when I stayed up till 3 a.m. tracking server loads and debugging code. When I told her the platform had launched, she barely looked up from her emails. "That's great, honey," she mumbled, typing furiously. "Did you remember to grab almond milk?" I remembered, always. But that night, after the dinner, after the fork fell, after the room turned toward me instead of her, I realized something. I had been loyal, but not to us. I had been loyal to the idea of us. The version of us she wanted the world to see. And that version, it didn't include the real me. I walked up to our bedroom an hour later. She was sitting at her vanity, wiping away her makeup with slow, angry strokes. The kind of silence between us wasn't new, but the weight of it had changed. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice low but sharp. "I told the truth. You made me look like I don't even know my husband." I sat on the edge of the bed. "You don't." She froze. Cloth paused against her cheek. "How can you say that?" I looked at her. Really looked. The woman I had loved for years. The woman I had raised children with. Celebrated anniversaries with. Buried parents with. But I also saw the woman who forgot to ask. Who forgot to listen. Who only saw me as a reflection of what she needed me to be. I can say it because you've never asked me who I am. You've never wanted to know more than what you could explain to your colleagues in 2 sentences. That's not fair. It is, I cut in. When I built the company, when I made my first $1 million, I was right here, making you breakfast, helping the kids with homework. You didn't see the late nights, the risks, the sacrifices. Or maybe you did, and you just thought it was a phase, a hobby. She opened her mouth to speak. I raised a hand. And when I didn't talk about it, it wasn't because I was hiding something. It was because I thought you'd ask. And when you didn't, I told myself that was okay. that support meant not needing to be understood. Her face changed then, not anger, not fear, just a kind of quiet devastation. "I thought you liked being in the background," she whispered. "I liked being beside you," I replied. "But somewhere along the way, you walked ahead and never looked back." She looked down. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I know." A long silence stretched between us, not hostile, not sharp, just tired. Then she asked the question I never thought she'd ask. "What else don't I know about you?" That stopped me cold, because it wasn't a trap. It wasn't a challenge. It was a crack. A moment of genuine vulnerability from a woman who rarely allowed herself to look small. I exhaled. "You don't know that I play piano at night when I can't sleep, that I've been funding scholarships for underprivileged coders across the country, that I've had 2 offers to sell the company and retire fully, but I didn't because building something that matters, it keeps me breathing." Her eyes lifted to meet mine, glossy now. "You've never told me those things, and you've never asked." That truth sat between us like a third person in the room. I stood and walked to the window. The backyard was quiet, the porch light casting long shadows over the empty patio furniture. The same space where we'd once danced barefoot after putting the kids to bed. I wondered if she remembered that. "I didn't mean to erase you," she said from behind me. "I don't think you meant to," I replied. "But you did." She came to stand beside me, not close, not touching, just near enough for her presence to feel human again. "What happens now?" she asked. I didn't answer right away, because I didn't know. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about resentment. It was about rediscovering whether the real me had a place in the world she'd built, whether there was room for truth after so many years of convenient silence. "I guess," I finally said, "we find out if you're ready to meet the man I've always been." She nodded, slowly, and for once she didn't look away. The next morning didn't begin with shouting. There were no accusations, no pointed silences over coffee, no dramatic slamming of drawers, just the quiet hum of the house doing what it always did, breathing around us. But something between us had shifted. Miranda came down the stairs, already dressed for work, sleek gray blazer, low ponytail, heels that tapped softly on the floor. Always composed, always in control. Except now, something in her movements felt unsure, hesitant. She paused at the kitchen island, where I was finishing up my second cup of coffee and reading through a funding proposal on my tablet. "You're not at the office today?" she asked, her voice neutral. "I'm in the office," I said, glancing up. "It just happens to be in the study." She nodded. The response made her lips purse slightly, like she was still reprogramming her image of me. "I've got a leadership strategy meeting today. Gerald's reshuffling some teams." I waited for her to add something more, an invitation, a question, anything that resembled the old rhythm of our mornings. But she didn't. She just stood there, uncertain, then turned toward the door. "Miranda." She froze mid-step. "I meant what I said last night. I'm not trying to compete with you. I never was. But I'm also not going to keep pretending to be someone I'm not just because it fits your narrative better." She turned, slow and deliberate. "I never asked you to pretend." I tilted my head. "No. But you made it very clear what version of me was acceptable. The quiet one. The convenient one. The one who knew when to shut up at dinner so your world didn't feel threatened." That landed. I saw it in the way her fingers curled slightly around the handle of her bag. "I don't feel threatened," she said. "Good," I replied. "Because you shouldn't. But you should feel responsible for the fact that I've spent the last 10 years walking beside you and still felt invisible." That silenced her again. Didn't know how big your company had gotten, she murmured. No, you didn't. And you didn't care to ask. But everyone else will know soon enough. We're filing to go public next quarter. Her eyebrows lifted. You're going public? I nodded. We've crossed the valuation threshold. It's time. I let that settle between us, not as a boast, but as a reality check. This wasn't about hurting her. This was about realigning the balance she had long since tipped too far in her own favor. Will I be part of that? She asked carefully. I mean, is this something you want me involved in? A question like that would have made my heart leap 10 years ago. But now? I don't need involvement, I said. I need acknowledgement. There's a difference. Miranda gave the faintest nod, then walked out the door. The moment it clicked behind her, I sat back and exhaled. I wasn't angry, not in the way I used to be when she dismissed my thoughts or made jokes about me being semi-retired at dinner parties. What I felt now was something calmer, a firm sense of direction. I had changed, and whether she came along for the rest of the ride or not, that was her choice. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was from Brett, the younger VP who had sat next to me at the dinner table. Gerald wants to talk. Can you meet for coffee tomorrow? Just you and him. Informal. I smirked. It had begun. By 3 p.m., I had 3 more emails in my inbox from people at Miranda's firm. All polite, all flattering, all curious. For years, I'd been the silent man at the edge of the photo, the +1, the afterthought. Now I was something else entirely. I was the man who made their boss pause mid-bite, the man who said he owned the company and meant it. When Miranda came home that evening, she was quieter than usual. Her shoes came off by the door, her keys dropped into the bowl with more care than necessary. She found me in the kitchen, pouring water into the kettle. Gerald brought you up at the meeting today, she said, without preamble. Everyone was talking about Luminary. You sort of became the unofficial topic. I said nothing, just waited. He asked me why I never mentioned who I was married to. And what did you say? I said I didn't realize who I was married to. Her honesty surprised me. And then, she added softly, he asked me if I thought you'd consider taking over as consultant for their AI integration team. Said he's been trying to get someone of your caliber for a year now. I poured hot water into my cup. What did you say? I said I didn't know, that I'd have to ask you. I looked at her. And do you want me to? Her expression flickered, vulnerability, frustration, pride, fear, all battling under the surface. I want to start seeing you clearly again, she said. And maybe sharing the spotlight. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was a crack of light in a wall that had been solid for too long. I took a sip. Then we'll start there. She nodded, walked over, sat across from me. And for the first time in years, she really looked at me, not through the lens of convenience or social expectations or company hierarchy. Just me. The man she had underestimated for too long. The man she would now have to get to know all over again. Over the next few days, something strange began to happen between Miranda and me. We talked, but not in the way long-married couples usually talk. Not about groceries or bills or what time the school called. We talked like strangers meeting at a crossroads, both clutching old maps, trying to figure out if they were still headed in the same direction. At first, it was small things. She'd wander into my study in the evenings and hover near the doorway, like a guest unsure if they were welcome. She'd ask questions, not about dinner or the kids, but about the platform, the tech, the team. I didn't know you had 60 employees, she said one night. I nodded. Most of them remote. The core engineering team's in Chicago, but I meet with them virtually every Monday. She blinked. And you manage all of that? Why do you sound surprised? She hesitated. I guess I just thought, I don't know. You always seemed so domesticated, I offered, a half smile on my face. She winced. Maybe. Just steady. Quiet. I am steady. But quiet doesn't mean passive. It never did. That silenced her, because Miranda had confused silence for surrender, stillness for smallness. She hadn't seen that the calm was always intentional, that I'd given her space to lead, not because I couldn't, but because I chose to. That night, we sat on the back porch like we used to, 2 cups of tea between us, the dog asleep at our feet, the air thick with memory. Do you remember when we used to dream about opening a bed and breakfast? She asked suddenly. I nodded. Back when we were broke and romantic. You said you'd cook, and I'd manage the books. And we'd live upstairs. Let strangers rent the rooms. I chuckled. You had the whole layout sketched in that old notebook. She smiled, wistful. I think I still have it. It was the first moment in weeks that felt like us. Not the version shaped by perception or performance, but the version that used to whisper ideas in bed and fall asleep before finishing them. I miss that version of us, she said quietly, before titles and promotions and silence. So do I. She leaned back in her chair, looking up at the stars. When did we stop being partners? I didn't answer, because we both already knew. It wasn't the dinners or the workload or the kids. It was the slow, creeping erosion of curiosity. The assumption that knowing someone once meant knowing them forever. She stopped asking who I was becoming, and I stopped offering the updates. We got lazy, I said finally. We got arrogant, she corrected. We thought love would carry the weight of everything else. I looked over at her. She wasn't wearing her corporate mask tonight. No heels, no lipstick, just her. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to lead the conversation. She was listening. There's something I want to tell you, I said, setting my cup down. She turned to me, waiting. I've been working on something for over a year, a partnership, with 2 federal agencies. It's classified, high-level cybersecurity stuff. If it finalizes, the company valuation will triple overnight. But more than that, I paused. It changes everything. Her eyes widened, but she stayed quiet. I'm telling you because this time, I want you to be part of it. Not because I need your approval, but because I want you to understand that this isn't a side project. It never was. This is who I am now. She nodded slowly. And I want to understand. We sat in silence for a long while after that. A silence that didn't ache. A silence that felt earned, shared. The next morning, Miranda left for work earlier than usual. But before she walked out the door, she came into my study and placed a mug of coffee beside my keyboard. I booked us a dinner next Friday, she said. Just you and me, no clients, no coworkers, no image to protect. I looked up at her. What's the occasion? She smiled. I want to meet my husband, the real one, from the beginning. And then she left. No more apologies, no promises, just a quiet beginning to something we hadn't done in years. Start over. But as I watched her leave, one thought lingered in the back of my mind. She had seen a version of me she didn't recognize, and instead of turning away, she came closer. That, more than anything, gave me hope, because the past might be over, but the future was finally being built by both of us. That week unfolded with a quiet sort of tension, not the brittle kind that snaps and breaks over time, but the kind that lingers in transition. We were unlearning who we thought we were to each other. That takes time, and it takes restraint. Miranda was still Miranda. She left in crisp suits, carried herself with that same iron-backed posture and stilettos, and came home with stories about board meetings, strategy huddles, and office politics. But something was softer now. She asked more questions, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. She stopped assuming. One night, I came upstairs late, after a long video call with my operations lead in Singapore. She was already in bed, scrolling through something on her phone. She looked up when I entered and said, "Did the architecture issue get resolved?" And I froze, not because of the question, but because it was the first time in years that she'd remembered something I mentioned in passing. Something about my work. "Yeah," I said. "We found a workaround. I had to rewrite half the back end, but it's stable now." She nodded. "That's good." And we both went to sleep, not as strangers lying side by side, but as people slowly returning to a place where listening was an act of love. But not everything had softened. On Thursday, Gerald called. Directly. No assistant, no middleman. "William," he began, "I hope you'll forgive me for being a bit forward, but I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and frankly, I think we need you more than you need us." I didn't say anything. Let him fill the silence. "I'd like to make you an offer," he continued. "A consulting role, high-level strategy, integration, AI ethics application. You'd have autonomy, no red tape, direct access, and a very generous retainer." I leaned back in my chair. I could feel the irony settle in like dust on an untouched shelf. The same man who likely viewed me as Miranda's quiet husband at cocktail parties was now dangling 6 figures and strategic power in front of me. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm not for sale." Gerald hesitated. "Is it the money?" "It's the alignment," I replied. "Your company still sees AI as a tool to chase clicks and predict behavior. My work is about infrastructure, protection, prevention. The foundation, not the billboard." He was quiet for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he said, "That's fair. I respect that." Before we ended the call, he added, "You really shook things up the other night. People are still talking." I smiled faintly. "Good, because that was never the plan. But sometimes silence only works for so long. Sometimes power has to be seen." That night, Miranda came home late. I heard her heels in the hallway, the soft thump of her purse hitting the side table. She came into my study and stood in the doorway. "I heard Gerald called you," she said. "He did. Did you say yes?" "No." She walked in and sat on the edge of my desk. Her posture was different, less polished, more present. "Why not?" she asked. I set down my pen. "Because I built something that matters to me. That doesn't mean I don't want to help others, but I won't shrink myself to fit inside someone else's machine. Not anymore." Her eyes searched mine. "I never realized how much you'd been shrinking." "You never looked long enough to see it." She didn't flinch at me. He just nodded. "You know," he said slowly, "when we first met, what I loved most about you was your calm. You made everything feel manageable. Like no matter what happened, you'd be steady." I was. "You still are," she whispered. "But now I realize that doesn't mean you were small. It means you were holding more than I ever saw." That moment cracked something open. She leaned forward, gently brushed a hand over mine, and said, "I'm proud of you. Not just for what you built, but for finally taking up space." And I believed her, because for the first time in our marriage, she wasn't afraid of my strength. The next morning, over coffee, she slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was a draft, an early outline of a proposal for a company-wide AI ethics committee at her firm. "I want your opinion," she said. "Not because you're my husband, but because you're the smartest person I know in this field." I didn't rush to read it. Instead, I looked at her, really looked. And then I said, "I'll read it. And I'll be honest, like I always should have been." She smiled. "You weren't invisible," she said. "You were just waiting for the right moment." And now it had come. But it wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of a new era, one where I no longer waited for permission to be seen. Friday night arrived with the kind of nervous energy usually reserved for first dates. Miranda had made a reservation at a quiet, privately owned Italian place tucked between a florist and a bookstore, a place we used to frequent before the kids, before the careers swallowed our evenings whole. She wore a simple navy blue dress, no blazer, no hard lines or statement jewelry, just soft curls, subtle makeup, and an air of someone trying not to overcompensate. "You look like you," I said when I opened the door to let her into the study before we left. She smiled. "That's the goal." At dinner, we didn't talk about work immediately. We talked about the boys, about the time Ryan broke his arm in the yard and she cried more than he did, about how Lucas still chewed his pen caps no matter how many times we scolded him. We laughed about it, laughed in a way that didn't feel forced. But eventually, the conversation turned to the shift that had been growing between us like a tide neither of us could stop. "I keep wondering," she said after a sip of red wine, "if I've spent the last 10 years turning you into a placeholder in my life." I didn't flinch. "You have." Her eyes dropped to her napkin. "I didn't mean to," she said quietly. Somewhere along the way, it became easier to tell a story about us than to check in on the truth of us. And in that story, you were safe, predictable, comfortable. And you needed that," I replied. "I get it. You were building something, and you didn't want any disruption in the image. I made it easy for you to forget that I was building something, too." She looked up. "I'm sorry." The apology sat there. Simple, director, not decorative. I nodded once. "Thank you." There was no need to unwrap it further. We were past picking at the bones of what went wrong. Now we had to decide what we were going to build from here. After dessert, she leaned in and said, "I told Gerald today that I won't be taking the VP track." That pulled my attention. "Really?" She nodded. "It's not what I want. It's what I thought I wanted, back when success felt like the only way to justify how hard I was pushing. But lately, it's just meetings stacked on meetings, decisions that don't feel real, and a constant need to perform." I studied her. "So what do you want?" She shrugged. "I don't know exactly, but I think I want to be around more. For the boys, for myself, for you." It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. It was honest. And that was more than I'd gotten from her in years. She reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. "I want to earn my way back into knowing who you are. Not because I'm your wife, but because I respect you now in a way I never let myself before." I turned my palm upward and held hers. "Then let's stop pretending this marriage is what it used to be," I said. "Let's stop acting like we're the same people we were when we started. We're not. And maybe that's okay," she said softly. "Maybe we're better now if we let ourselves be." The ride home was quiet, but the good kind, the kind where silence doesn't feel like avoidance, but space. As we pulled into the driveway, she placed a hand on my arm. "Do you think," she asked, "we can be new people in the same marriage?" I looked at our house, our porch light glowing, the curtains drawn, the faint hum of life waiting inside. "I think we have to be," I said, "because the old version died quietly while we weren't looking. We either bury it or we build from its bones." She nodded. Inside the house, the boys were asleep. The dog stirred slightly, then settled again. Miranda poured 2 cups of tea and joined me in the living room. No TV, no phones, just 2 people trying again. She reached over and placed her hand on my knee. "I don't want permission anymore," she said. "I want partnership." And that was it. Not the end, not the resolution, but the choice to respect instead of manage, to ask instead of assume, to see each other again, not as placeholders or props, but as equal architects of a life worth rebuilding. That was the real dinner worth remembering. And this time, no one dropped their fork. The following Monday was uneventful by most standards: emails, Zoom calls, budget reviews. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Not just in the house, but in the rhythm of my days. Miranda had started waking earlier again. She made her own coffee instead of expecting it poured and waiting. She peeked into my study once mid-morning, not to interrupt, but to offer a smile. No questions, no performative concern, just presence. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't calculating how to shrink to make room for her orbit. That afternoon, I got a text from Lucas's school. He forgot his science project. Normally, Miranda handled those things, delegated them, scheduled them, or reminded me as she rushed out the door. But this time, I didn't need a reminder. I saw the message, grabbed the project from the kitchen counter, and drove to the school without telling her. When I came home, she was standing at the kitchen sink, looking out the window. She turned when she heard the door. "Did Lucas text me?" she asked. "No, the school did. I already dropped it off." Something flickered in her expression. Not guilt, not shame. Something quieter. Surprise. "I didn't even notice it was here," she said, more to herself. I nodded. "It's handled." She walked around the island and stopped in front of me. "You've always handled it. I just stopped seeing it." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because that acknowledgement, unscripted, unrehearsed, meant more than any apology. "I think I spent so long being the woman everyone respected," she continued, "that I forgot I already had the respect of the person who mattered most, and I took it for granted." I set the keys on the counter. "You didn't just take me for granted, Miranda. You made me invisible." She winced, but she didn't walk away. "And that's what I'm trying to undo," she said. "One moment at a time, if you'll let me." I looked at her, at the woman who had so carefully curated every angle of our lives, until the truth finally shattered the staging. "I don't want a wife who looks good on paper," I said. "I want a partner who looks me in the eye." Her voice dropped. "And what if I don't know how to do that anymore?" "Then we start simple," I said. "We build eye contact back into the routine." She smiled, a real one this time, and I could see the weight lifting off her, this version of her that didn't have to perform every second to earn love. That night, as I sat in my study reviewing pitch decks for an upcoming investor meeting, she came in with 2 mugs of tea, mint for her, black for me, like always. She didn't sit on the edge of the desk this time. She sat across from me, equal distance, equal footing. "I know it's not much," she said, nodding at the tea, "but I wanted to show up, not as your wife, just as someone who respects what you're building." And maybe that was the moment it all clicked for me. Not just the shift in our marriage, but the shift in me. Because for years I'd been waiting to be recognized, to be valued, to be seen. But the truth is, the person who needed to see me first was me. I had let myself disappear under the banner of support. I had let love become a form of quiet servitude. I had let her ambition override my own identity because I believed that was what loyalty looked like. It wasn't. Loyalty without boundaries becomes sacrifice. Sacrifice without recognition becomes resentment. And resentment is how good people slowly disappear in plain sight. So now I didn't need her validation to feel worthy. I had already proven that to myself when I built something from scratch, in silence, with no applause. What I wanted now was different. I wanted mutual recognition. Miranda sipped her tea and set it down. "You've changed," she said. "So have you," I replied. She nodded slowly. "Maybe we both just finally stopped pretending." And for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like I was sitting across from a woman trying to manage the version of me she was comfortable with. I was sitting across from a woman who was finally trying to know the man I had become. And that was worth everything. Friday came faster than expected. The investor meeting was scheduled for noon, a high-stakes video call with 3 potential backers and 2 current silent partners. I wasn't nervous, not because the stakes were low, but because I knew what I was presenting. I knew what I'd built. Still, it was the first time Miranda had ever watched me in action. She didn't say she would, just quietly stepped into the study 10 minutes before the call, carrying a legal pad already scribbling. She sat on the armchair across from my desk, respectful, silent, eyes sharp. I glanced at her once before we started. She gave me the smallest nod. I'm here. I'm watching. The call began. Numbers were discussed. Timelines laid out. Frameworks examined and dissected. I answered everything, clearly, confidently, the way you do when your fingerprints are all over something real. Then came the big question. Your company has a strong technical foundation, one of the investors said, but it's also unusually quiet. Why the lack of marketing, no press coverage, no founder profiles? I didn't blink. Because we don't build for the camera. We build for endurance. We don't want press. We want protection. We solve what people never want to advertise as problems. Data breaches, surveillance gaps, national vulnerabilities. You don't sell that with a flashy slogan. You sell it by never failing. They were quiet for a beat. Miranda's pen stopped moving. And then the oldest of the 3 investors smiled and said, I respect that. A rare thing these days. We closed the call 47 minutes later with a verbal commitment from 2 and a follow-up schedule from the 3rd. When I finally leaned back in my chair, Miranda was still sitting there, still holding the pen. That, she said softly, was the most powerful thing I've ever watched. I raised an eyebrow. And you've watched some pretty high-stakes conference room showdowns. She nodded, then laughed. Exactly. But this wasn't a performance. This was you. I smiled. Nice to finally meet me? She nodded again. Nice to finally realize I never did before. It wasn't meant as a confession, but it landed like one. And then, that afternoon, the second wave hit. The firm Miranda worked for held its quarterly leadership meeting. Gerald invited department heads, regional leads, and a few outside consultants, including someone from my advisory board, apparently. The connection was made within 5 minutes. My name mentioned once in the wrong room, and suddenly half the office was scrambling to reconcile the man at last week's dinner with the founder of a company that just received 8-figure investment attention. By 3 p.m., Miranda texted me from her office. Your name just made the internal report slide deck. Gerald wants to re-explore opportunities. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. It wasn't about spite, or revenge, or rubbing it in. It was about inevitability. Truth, real, steady, undeniable truth, always makes its way to the surface, no matter how long it's been buried under someone else's image of you. Miranda came home that night unusually quiet. She didn't seem tired, just introspective, like someone who had been shown the full picture and was now scanning every corner of the frame she once cropped to her comfort. After dinner, she came into the study. Again, no heels this time, no pretense, just Miranda. A version I hadn't seen in years. I've been talking about you for years, she said, standing by the doorway. At dinners, in conferences, in little side conversations, always small anecdotes. My husband's in tech. He consults here and there. She looked at me. I didn't lie, but I made you smaller. I set down my mug. You made me digestible. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. I hate that you're right. I walked over slow. I let you do it. She looked up. Why? Because I thought shrinking was love. And then she stepped forward, not to explain, not to argue, but to simply stand beside me. Not in front, not behind, beside. I want to spend the rest of this marriage making space, she said. Not for me, not for appearances, but for us. Equal space. It hit me harder than any apology. Because this wasn't about recognition anymore. This was about redistribution. Power, voice, presence, truth. That night, for the first time in a long time, we didn't go to bed just as husband and wife. We went to bed as two people finally on level ground. And I slept better than I had in years. Saturday mornings used to be hers. Pilates, facials, brunch with friends who talked in abbreviations and buzzwords. I used to make pancakes for the boys, fix a broken shelf, or disappear into my code while the rest of the house played weekend. But now that the mask was off, the silence between us wasn't something to fill. It was something to share. She made coffee that morning. For both of us. No performative gestures, no lipstick at 8 a.m. Just a woman in an oversized hoodie and bare feet pouring 2 mugs, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she had done it every day. She hadn't. But today, she did. I looked up from the kitchen table where I was reading investor notes, and for a second, I didn't see Miranda the presentation. I saw Miranda the person. She slid the mug across the table. I turned down the board seat offer. I blinked. From who? Alexis Stratton. You remember her. Her fund wanted to add me to their advisory team. Said it would raise my public profile. I told her I was learning how to raise something else for a change. Awareness. I gave a quiet chuckle. Of what? Of what matters. Of who I married. I looked at her. She meant it, and the weight of those words wasn't heavy. It was honest. She didn't owe me repentance. I didn't need her to grovel. But for the first time, I could see she was letting go of the version of success that required me to be invisible. The boys barreled down the stairs minutes later, a flurry of cereal demands and mismatched socks. Miranda didn't retreat. She didn't check her phone. She sat down. She passed spoons. She laughed. And she didn't once reach for her phone when I mentioned the Series C meeting next week. Later that day, we took the kids out. No occasion. No forced family outing. Just a walk downtown, a stop for ice cream, an hour in the park. Miranda didn't walk ahead like she usually did. She stayed next to me. At one point, Lucas ran up and shouted, "Dad, is it true you own a robot company now?" Miranda looked at me. Not annoyed, not embarrassed, curious. I knelt beside him. Not robots, just the stuff that makes smart systems smarter. He thought about it. Like spy stuff? I smiled. Sometimes. He grinned and ran off, and Miranda stood there, staring after him. Then she said softly, "He's proud of you." I know. I'm proud of you. That one I hadn't expected, because it had taken her years to say it. Not in cards, not in holiday toasts, but directly, to me. That night, as we lay in bed with the lights off and the hum of the ceiling fan above us, she whispered, "You've always been powerful. I just didn't know that kind of power could be quiet." And I turned to her. "It's not quiet. It's just not loud for show." She nodded against the pillow. Then came the question I had been waiting for, not out of vanity, but out of hope. "Can I be part of it now?" "Of the company?" I asked. "Of the life behind it," she said. I took a long breath. Not because I was hesitant, but because I knew what that meant. It meant giving her access not just to what I had built, but to who I had become in building it. And this time, I wasn't going to do that quietly. I wasn't going to translate myself into half-truths or wait for her to ask. I was going to bring her in, with clarity, with terms, with reality. "You can," I said, "but not as a guest, not as someone who drops in. If you want in, It has to be as a partner. Equal, in every sense. She nodded in the dark. That's all I've ever wanted. I just didn't know I had to make space for someone else's center when I was so busy building my own. And for the first time in years, we didn't fall asleep next to each other. We fell asleep aligned, not just as a couple, but as co-creators of a life where power didn't need permission to exist, where being seen didn't mean being loud, where love didn't come from shrinking, but from expanding side by side. 2 weeks later, Gerald hosted another dinner. This time it wasn't in some cold, high-ceilinged restaurant with starched napkins and wine lists the size of novels. It was at his home, outdoors, under twinkling string lights, and the kind of curated ease that says, we're successful, but still relatable. Miranda got the invitation first. We can skip it, she said, reading my face as I glanced at the email. Really, I won't be offended. I looked up from my desk. You want to? I want to go, she admitted, but only if you do too. That was new. There had been so many evenings, anniversaries, company galas, formal nights, where I was the afterthought in her plans, the silent plus one, the one who kept the seat warm. But not this time. This time, I wasn't going as her husband. We were going together, as equals. At the dinner, the tone was different. Gerald greeted us both with the kind of handshake that wasn't just friendly, it was strategic. There was respect there now. He asked about the company, the IPO. He didn't look through me to talk to Miranda or pretend like I was a placeholder for someone else more relevant. And Miranda? She didn't once try to take the conversational spotlight. She didn't shrink beside me either. She knew when to speak, when to defer. She introduced me not as my husband who works in tech, but as the founder of Luminary Systems, the reason the entire East Coast avoided a major infrastructure collapse last quarter. I raised an eyebrow at her. She shrugged and grinned. What? You were being too modest. Midway through the meal, the table's energy shifted. Someone asked about balancing career and family, and a younger executive's wife leaned across and said, Miranda, how do you manage being married to someone that successful? It was a test, the kind that women like Miranda were used to fielding, but rarely from this angle. There was a time she would have smiled, laughed, and made a self-deprecating joke. Something like, well, someone has to keep him grounded. Or, we keep our work lives separate. That's the key. But she didn't. She looked at me first, not for help, but for alignment. And then she said, I used to think success had to be visible to be real. I thought if someone wasn't talking about their achievements, they didn't have any. But I married a man who taught me that some of the most powerful people don't raise their voice. They just raise the standard. The table went quiet. Not awkward, not forced, just reverent. And that was the moment I realized. She wasn't just proud of me. She was finally proud to be beside me. Not because it reflected well on her, but because she saw me now. After dinner, as the guests wandered to the patio, sipping from crystal glasses and trading stories about market trends and board seats, Miranda and I stepped away. We found a quieter corner of the garden. She turned to me and said, Was that okay? I looked at her. You didn't flinch. You didn't perform. You stood there and told the truth. She exhaled. It felt good. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. That's because you didn't have to shrink this time. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. And you didn't have to hide. And maybe that's what the whole journey had been about. Not control, not dominance, not flipping power dynamics. Just two people learning how to make room for each other again. Because when you finally stop managing someone's image and start respecting their truth, something incredible happens. You don't just rediscover your partner. You meet the version of yourself who was waiting to be seen, too. 3 months later, I sat at the head of a different table. This one wasn't dimly lit or dressed in linen. It wasn't filled with wine glasses or networking smiles. It was long, modern, surrounded by glass walls overlooking the city. My company's new executive conference room. Everyone was in place. COO, CFO, legal. My new head of strategy had flown in from Austin. The final pre-IPO briefing. It was all happening. What I'd built from scratch, with code and grit and silence, was now public knowledge. But the seat beside me was empty. Until Miranda walked in. Not overdressed, not underdressed, just right. A fitted blazer, soft blouse, no corporate theater. And she wasn't here to impress anyone. She wasn't here to represent me. She was here because I'd asked her to be. She took the seat without hesitation. The team noticed, and they understood. I had made it clear. I didn't want her opinion out of courtesy. I valued it. I started the meeting like I always did. Steady, focused, measured. Halfway through, I laid out our long-term impact model. Security, sustainability, internal ethics tracking. Then I paused, turned to Miranda and said, "Would you like to speak to the integration side we discussed?" She nodded, stood, and spoke without looking at notes. Confident. Director. No filler. Not as my wife. As a woman who'd spent the last 10 years running teams, pitching ideas, and learning how to stand tall in rooms that tried to shorten her. But this room didn't do that. Because she wasn't beside a placeholder anymore. She was beside someone who didn't need her permission to be powerful. When the meeting ended, the team filed out. Some congratulated her. Others nodded with new awareness. She took none of it for granted. We walked back to my office together. Closed the door behind us. She leaned against the glass wall, arms crossed. "You realize the old me would have been terrified of today?" "I know," she smiled. "And I would have tried to outshine you, because I didn't know how to stand next to you." "You do now," she nodded, "and I like the view better from here." I walked over, leaned beside her, shoulder to shoulder, both of us looking out over the city. "When did you know it was working?" she asked. "What?" "This us. The new version. I thought about it. About the way she brought me coffee without obligation. About how she sat through my meetings, not with admiration, but with attention. About how she never used the word just to describe my work anymore. When I no longer had to shrink so you could shine, I said, and you didn't see my strength as a threat, but as something you could trust." She didn't speak. She just took my hand, not for balance, but for solidarity. That weekend we had dinner with the boys. No milestones, no guests, just us. Lucas told a joke that made Ryan spit soda across the table. Miranda laughed until she cried. I watched her wipe her eyes with her napkin and reach for my hand under the table. And I thought, this is what power really looks like. Not the kind that makes noise, not the kind that needs a spotlight, but the kind that sits silently at the head of the table, knowing exactly what it's built and exactly who built it with you. And the only sound that mattered now was the laughter we didn't have to earn by being small. The story began at dinner with her saying, "Just don't embarrass me." But it ended here, at a different table, where we didn't just make room for each other. We rebuilt the table entirely, together. And finally, we both had a seat.